bevacizumab was first approved as a Avastin, which was utilized for the treatment of colon cancer systemically. And so we've been using bevacizumab off-label for nearly 20 years for intravitreal or ocular use. So it's really surprising that it took that long for a pharmaceutical company to come along and really dedicate the resources and time that was needed in order to formulate a FDA sort of approval type product of bevacizumab. So I was kind of surprised by that, but excited because I think that this helps take out some of those questions and potential concerns that we have about compounded bevacizumab.
I'd mentioned this is a long time coming after three CRLs. What do you think that this
Yeah.
signals about the regulatory bar for repurposing an off-label standard of care?
I think this highlights that although compounded bevacizumab has been utilized off-label in clinical practice, extensively for years on end, the FDA is still really holding them to the same standards that they would for a novel drug application, right? Requiring evidence of efficacy in neovascular AMD from well-designed randomized controlled trials, which in the case of Lytenava, this was NORSE 2 and NORSE 8. The FDA is evaluating more than just the drug bevacizumab itself and its clinical efficacy, but rather they're also ensuring that Lytenava, the commercial formulation itself, is meeting the standards for consistent manufacturing, product quality, sterility, stability, appropriate market labeling. So they're evaluating so much more than just the drug itself when they're taking this into consideration.
What does having this formulation now FDA approved and eye specific actually, what can it change for how you're implementing it into a practice?
We've known for a long time that bevacizumab, the molecule itself, really works, although it's relatively short-lived, unfortunately, especially in patients with neovascular AMD. The major change is that we now have confidence in an FDA-approved product quality. When bevacizumab comes from a compounded pharmacy, there's always going to be some potential concerns surrounding repackaging, sterility, variability from batch to batch. And so this FDA approved product allows us to have some confidence in standardized manufacturing, that the formulation from batch to batch is uniform, less variability, a greater sterility, and control of the manufacturing process. So it kind of gives us a little bit more reassurance when we're treating patients with this FDA approved product.
So how do you expect pricing and access of bevacizumab to differ from off-label and on-label options?
Yeah, I think this is yet to be seen and a really interesting consideration. I think the cost of Lytenava will likely be the most important determinant of how it's adopted into clinical practice and how similarly it matches the price of off-label compounded bevacizumab. Because we know compounded bevacizumab is really utilized because it's dirt cheap, right? Like $50 to $100 per injection. And it isn't going away just because Lytenava has come onto the market. And so it's going to continue to remain popular amongst those who are primarily cost conscious. And an FDA approved commercial product is going to carry with it substantial higher manufacturing, regulatory, distribution costs, etc. So I think potentially if Lytenava is priced only, slightly above compounded bevacizumab, many practices are going to favor it because of that confidence in the manufacturing and FDA approval regulatory process. However, if the price is substantially higher than compounded bevacizumab, I think that's going to hurt in terms of the adoption into practice generally.
So we've had nearly 2 decades of off-label. So now looking
Yeah.
forward a decade, do you expect on-label bevacizumab to displace compounded use, or will the cost keep compounded product at bay? What would you think?
I should sure hope that there is an FDA-approved bevacizumab product that does eventually, replace compounded bevacizumab because when we use FDA-approved products, they're generally safer and provide higher quality of patient care. For right now, it's important, I think, to understand too that Lytenava is only FDA approved for neovascular AMD. So it's not even changing the landscape for the management of diabetic macular edema, retinal vein occlusion, diabetic retinopathy, etc. But ultimately, I think that answer is going to depend on economics, how insurance reimbursements, pre-authorization and regulations kind of come into play and what they're willing to cover when it comes to these on-label bevacizumab products.
Anything else on FDA approval? Any other thoughts that you had that we haven't touched on yet?
Yeah, I think Lytenava kind of fits in the realm of a lot of ranibizumab, like Lucentis or ranibizumab biosimilars. It's certainly not going to take the place or even kind of touch the high patient quality of these newer generation anti-VEGF agents, such as Vabysmo or Eylea HD, because they offer an extended duration of action. So I think, Eylea HD and Vabysmo are still going to remain like the top tier standard of care that when these on-label bevacizumab or other products fail, we have something else we can go to that is more efficacious and can offer a decreased treatment burden for our patients.